Good morning, boys and girls. Before we get into today's news story, I just want to review some information that you have learned so far. So you guys have learned that the Pilgrims had chose to leave England and go to America. Remember, they wanted to be able to go to their own church, but the king had told them no, they had to go to the Church of England. So the Pilgrims decided to leave so they could be happier and have the freedom to choose how they wanted to worship. So the Pilgrims are just one group of people that had came to the United States um, and to set up colonies in North America. The colonies then became the United States of America, the new nation. So in the last read aloud, you had heard about George Washington fighting against the army of the King of Great Britain and won freedom from the king for the colonists. Remember, the United States is not a kingdom ruled by a king. Its form of government is a democracy. A kingdom is ruled by a king. A democracy is a form of government ruled by the people. In the very first read aloud, you had heard about the founding fathers who wrote the Constitution, which remember is a set of rules for the government to follow so that the president couldn't become like a king. Remember, the president doesn't work alone to make all the laws and rules to be followed. He works with the three parts of the government. So it's the president, the Congress, and the Supreme Court that all work together. And they have many important jobs to play, so the president doesn't have all the power like a king. So in this read aloud, you're going to hear about events that took place a long time ago. King George III ruled Great Britain, the American colonies, and other places a long time ago. The American Revolution was the name of the war that George Washington fought because the people of the American colonies wanted their freedom from Great Britain. And the war the colonies fought against Great Britain is called the American Revolution or the Revolutionary War. So before George Washington became the first president of America, he was a leader in the American Revolution. He fought for the American colonies in the American Continental Army. In the very last read aloud, you had learned about the legend of the cherry tree. You learned that George Washington was known for his honesty. Well, in this read aloud, you're going to learn about another one of George Washington's qualities, being clever. So in this read aloud, George Washington, it's General George Washington. And also you're going to hear about a man named Henry Knox who worked under Washington. I want you to listen carefully for the clever way in which General George Washington and Colonel Henry Knox tricked the British Army. So looking at our first slide here, there is a picture of Knox over here and Washington. So Henry Knox was a clever man. Before the American Revolution began, he and his wife had owned a bookshop in the city of Boston, Massachusetts. So another word for clever is smart. Henry Knox had loved the quiet, peaceful life of a bookseller, but all that was in the past now. Henry Knox, bookseller, had become Colonel Henry Knox of the American Continental Army. He worked directly with General George Washington, another clever man who commanded that army, and the two men had become great friends. So here they are, Knox and Washington. At the Continental Camp just outside the city of Boston, Henry Knox had a puzzled look on his face. Looking at General Washington, he asked, "But, sir, how can we keep the larger British army from marching out of Boston and destroying our soldiers here? We don't even have enough bullets or gunpowder for all of our soldiers." "If the British only knew," George Washington answered him. "Yes, Colonel, if only they knew, but they do not know. The British think we have more men than we really have. They do not know that many of those whom we do have lack anything to shoot at them with, as you mentioned. So we must make sure that they do not find out. Let them think we are stronger than we are, so that they will wish to stay comfortably in Boston through this long, cold winter, at least until we are ready for them. But in order for us to get ready, we need more gunpowder and bullets. So they're thinking up a really good plan. And here is showing us Boston and Ticonderoga. So Colonel, whoops, let me move my picture here. So Colonel Knox thought for a few moments and then smiled. General, he asked, would 50 cannons and the cannonballs and gunpowder to use with them help? Washington looked startled. Where could we get? He stopped. A light of understanding shone in his eyes. Fort Ticonderoga, he exclaimed. Brilliant, Colonel. Now that we have captured Fort Ticonderoga from the British, we have captured their cannons too. You are to gather a team of carefully chosen men. In the morning, you will leave to bring those cannons here. Travel as quickly as you can. Meanwhile, my job here will be to convince the British General, General Howe, that we are too strong for him to attack. Washington knew his small army could not win against General Howe's larger army, so he had to find a clever way to convince General Howe that Washington's army was much larger than it really was. I will order our men to build high mounds of dirt in front of our camp. General Howe will not be able to see past the dirt. Then I will march our men up and down at either end. He will not know we are moving the same men from place to place. Instead, he will think we have more soldiers than we really do. By putting up the dirt mounds, we will also appear to be settling in for a long time. Oops. General Howe will think, those colonial soldiers are expecting to keep us trapped here in Boston. They are certainly sure of themselves. He may think that it would be better to leave Boston on board his ships rather than stay. If we can force the British to leave, we will be in charge of the harbor again. Then, unlike the British, we can bring in supplies from other American cities on the coast. We will move the supplies to our armies all across the countryside because our friends there will help us. Washington went over the idea in his mind. It might work, he said. It must work. So here is that image again of Boston and Ticonderoga. It did work. Colonel Knox and his men marched off through the cold New England winter and returned in little less than 2 months with cannons and supplies. They had loaded these things onto carts and used huge, heavy animals called oxen to pull the carts back to Washington's camp outside of Boston. So remember, they didn't have cars back then. They used horses and buggies, so they had an oxen that would pull the carts. And look at how big these cannons were. So they were pretty heavy. When they arrived, the waiting American soldiers sent up a mighty cheer. Hearing the noise, Washington came out of his tent. Seeing Henry Knox riding his horse at the head of the line of men, oxen, and supplies, Washington stepped forward to greet them. Welcome back, Colonel. I am glad to see you and our cannons. Knox climbed down from his horse, turned and saluted. Thank you, sir. It is good to see you too, and to know that I will not have to spend another night on the march. And I have additional good news. We have also brought enough gunpowder and bullets so that our soldiers here will finally have something to fire out of their gun barrels. Over in Boston, the British guards heard the shouts of joy too and ran to tell General Howe. Something is going on, General, but we cannot see what it is because of the dirt mounds the colonists built. So here you can see the cannons. Later that same day, however, General Howe looked up to see 59 cannons aimed his way from on top of the dirt mounds. Now, he thought, there is no way to safely attack Washington and his men. Of course, he did not know that he might have done that successfully any time in the 2 months it had taken Henry Knox to bring the cannons. Soon afterward, the British left Boston. The plan of Washington and Knox had worked. Afterward, several things changed in important ways. First, the city of Boston was back in American hands. This was great news for the people there, and it also made Americans throughout the 13 colonies think, if we are strong enough to force British soldiers out of Boston, maybe we can win our freedom after all. Though some American colonists remained loyal to Great Britain and chose to leave with General Howe, many Americans who had been afraid before came forward to help. They had begun to hope that they really could defeat the British. So here is a map of the American colonies. The second change was that George Washington had learned something important. The British Army almost always wins when they fight on an open battlefield. From now on, we will attack and then quickly move away to attack in another place, or we will trap them up on the coast as we did in Boston. If we can keep them cooped up in coastal areas, they cannot come onto land to attack us. If they cannot attack us, they cannot beat us. If they cannot beat us, they will grow tired of this war and leave us in peace. It sounds like he has a really good plan. So here is the picture again of Knox and Washington. There was a third change too. Washington called in Colonel Knox and told him, "Congratulations, Henry. I am making you a general. I am putting you in charge of all of our cannons, not just the ones you brought from Fort Ticonderoga." George Washington and Henry Knox, the wealthy farmer from Virginia and the bookseller from Boston, became lifelong friends. General Knox helped General Washington win the American Revolution. A few years later, when Washington became president, he asked Henry Knox to become America's first Secretary of War, who is a person who helps the president keep soldiers and sailors ready in case there should be another war. However, having fought one war already, the two friends worked together and made a wonderful peace instead. All right, down below I will post the comprehension questions that go along with this read aloud. I'll talk to you boys and girls soon.